In the spring of 1849, deep within the humid lowlands of rural Arkansas, Margaret Boone went into labor alone. Her husband, Thomas Boone, had died 3 months earlier after being trampled beneath a mule cart, leaving her widowed, penniless, and carrying what the town called the last of the Boone curse. The midwife never made it to the house that night. A flood had washed out the road. So Margaret brought her children into the world by the dim light of an oil lamp and the tolling of a thunderstorm. When she saw what God had sent her, she screamed so loud the neighbors swore they heard it miles away. The boys were born joined at the lower back. 2 torsos, 2 heads, 4 arms, but 1 shared spine. Each took a breath at the same time. Each cried at the same pitch. Margaret, trembling and soaked in sweat, whispered that they were 2 hearts for 1 soul. She named them Elias and Ephraim, and from that night onward she kept the curtains drawn and the doors barred. The local preacher, Reverend Cottle, visited a week later. The stench of blood and rot hit him before he reached the porch. Margaret met him outside, pale as the sheets hanging behind her, and told him the boys were sick. He offered to pray for them, but she refused to let him in. That refusal spread through town faster than gossip ever should. Before long, people stopped passing the Boone house altogether. As the years passed, the twins grew, strong, enormous, and inseparable. They learned to move in rhythm, their steps a strange, mirrored gait that unsettled anyone who saw it. They rarely spoke to outsiders. Their mother homeschooled them, fed them from the same bowl, and scolded them when one tried to act independently. "You were born together," she would whisper, "and together you'll die." By their teens, Elias and Ephraim had become legends whispered among children. Some claimed they saw them walking the fields at dusk, pulling dead cattle toward the barn. Others said they heard 2 voices singing from one body, hymns warped into lullabies that made dogs howl. But one story carried the most weight, that Margaret Boone had once been seen carrying a shotgun toward the barn, weeping uncontrollably. When asked later, she said she'd heard something inside the barn whispering to her sons, not in words, but in a low, steady hum, like the sound of something alive beneath the floorboards. In the fall of 1865, a traveling doctor came to town offering to examine the twins. Margaret refused him too. She said the Lord had already judged her children. That night, her house caught fire. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to blacken the walls and leave smoke scars across the ceiling. The next morning the doctor was gone. His wagon, however, was found 2 miles down the road, wheels still spinning, horses missing. From that day onward, no outsider entered the Boone property again. The fields grew wild, the river changed its course, and only one light ever glowed in the farmhouse window. Dim, yellow, and always burning long past midnight. Some said Margaret had lost her mind. Others said the boys had taken something from her. But those who lived long enough to remember the old woman's face swore one thing above all. She wasn't afraid of her sons. She was afraid for them, because every night before she went to bed, neighbors heard her voice through the still air, praying the same words over and over again. "Lord, don't let them forget they're only half men." By the summer of 1866, the Boone farmhouse had become little more than a rumor wrapped in vines. The war had ended, the South was changing, but nothing seemed to touch that small patch of Arkansas soil. Travelers who passed through said the air there felt thicker, as if the earth itself refused to breathe. Elias and Ephraim were now 17, towering, broad-shouldered, their conjoined frames moving with eerie coordination. They could plow fields faster than any 2 men in town, though no one ever saw them working in daylight. At dusk, neighbors sometimes glimpsed them trudging through the fields by lantern glow, the light bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp, their heavy silhouettes bending in perfect unison. After Margaret stopped attending church, Reverend Cottle paid another visit. He returned pale and trembling, muttering that the Boone boys were not natural in God's eyes. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, only said that Margaret had built a door beneath the floor when she forbade anyone to touch. It was around this time that people began hearing strange noises from the Boone land, hammering, dragging, sometimes a woman's voice humming hymns that no one recognized. Then one night, the sheriff's deputy claimed he saw sparks rising from behind the house, followed by a metallic clanging sound that echoed across the hills. By dawn, an iron door had been built into the earth behind the barn, thick, bolted, and newly sealed with concrete. Margaret's behavior changed too. She was seen wandering into town, muttering about preparing the womb of the soil and keeping the blood pure. When a neighbor asked if she needed help, she smiled with blackened teeth and whispered, "It's almost ready." Inside the farmhouse, Elias and Ephraim had grown quiet and withdrawn. Their once childish rivalry turned into something darker, jealousy so fierce it bordered on violence. Elias accused Ephraim of stealing their mother's love. Ephraim claimed Elias was whispering to someone else at night. They'd argue for hours, yet they never separated. And every morning, Margaret would emerge with fresh scratches down her arms, insisting the boys were only testing their bond. In 1871, a census taker rode through the valley and tried to document the Boone family. He never returned to town. His horse came back without a rider, saddle torn, and a broken camera dangling from the straps. When a search party arrived at the Boone farm, the place was silent. No lights, no voices, not even the sound of animals. The front door stood open, and the air smelled of rust and old milk. They found Margaret sitting in her rocking chair, eyes open, body still. She had died clutching a Bible, its pages torn and marked with verses from Genesis, and the two shall become one flesh. The twins were nowhere to be found. The sheriff sealed the property, claiming the boys had likely fled. But a week later, a ranch hand reported hearing two voices singing softly from the woods behind the farm. Same tune, same breath, as if one throat carried two tones. He swore he saw a flicker of lantern light before it disappeared into the trees. That same night, the iron door behind the barn was seen open, and then, just as quickly, closed again, and from that moment on, the Boone name became something people whispered only when the sun was high and the road was clear. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? If you want to know what truly waited inside the Boone farmhouse, don't forget to subscribe. 8 years passed before anyone dared step foot near the Boone property again. By then, the house had become a skeleton of its former self. Windows blackened, porch rotting, the fields swallowed by tall grass. Most in town believed the Boone brothers were long dead, their names reduced to ghost stories told to frighten children. Then, in the spring of 1873, two young women arrived by stagecoach, Clara and June Boone, cousins from Tennessee, clutching a single letter written in an unfamiliar hand. It claimed the farm now belonged to them by blood right. Locals warned them to turn back, but the sisters, desperate and orphaned after their parents' deaths, pressed on toward the valley. The moment they crossed the boundary fence, the air changed. The birds went silent. The sisters later wrote in Clara's journal that the air smelled like iron and rain, even though the sky was clear. When they reached the farmhouse, they found the front door slightly ajar, as though waiting for them. Inside, the house was strangely intact. Furniture covered in sheets, dishes still set on the table, and a Bible open to the book of Genesis. But the most unsettling discovery was the sound that came from beneath the floorboards, a steady, faint knocking like the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. That night, Clara claimed she woke to the sound of someone humming. Thinking it was her sister, she whispered for her to stop, but June was fast asleep beside her. The humming continued, joined by a second, deeper voice. When Clara looked toward the doorway, she saw the shape of two men standing perfectly still, their bodies fused by shadow. The next morning, the sisters found fresh food on the kitchen table, bread, eggs, even a jug of milk. No footprints led to or from the house. When June lifted the jug to pour, she saw muddy fingerprints along the handle. The following days blurred. At first, the voices outside the house whispered through the fields at dusk. Then came gifts, ribbons, carved figurines, wildflowers arranged on the porch. The sisters thought someone in town was trying to scare them, until one night June vanished. Clara found her the next morning near the barn, her gown soaked in dew, staring blankly toward the trees. When asked what happened, June said softly, "They came from the earth." Weeks later, both sisters began changing. They grew pale, nauseous, and withdrawn. Clara's journal turned frantic, pages filled with half-written sentences about bloodlines and union. She wrote that the brothers had returned, taller and stronger, their conjoined frames hidden beneath long coats. Elias and Ephraim spoke gently at first, claiming to be protectors, two halves of one husband, chosen by God to preserve the Boone name. When Clara tried to flee, the brothers blocked her path, whispering in unison, "You were born to us." By late 1875, the townspeople noticed the sisters rarely left the property. When asked, Elias told a passerby that the family was growing. No one saw them again that winter. 1 year later, a hunter passing through the woods swore he saw two immense figures standing at the edge of the field, each holding the hand of a woman heavy with child. He turned to run, but before he reached the road, he heard the faint sound of laughter, 4 voices sharing one breath. By 1876, whispers about the Boone property had turned into dread. The old preacher was dead, but townsfolk swore his ghost lingered near the churchyard, mumbling verses about sins that multiply in darkness. For years, no one dared approach the Boone land until a drought forced the neighboring farms to seek new wells. One morning, a group of men rode past the Boone fence line and saw something strange. The fields had been plowed. The soil was freshly turned, though no crops were growing. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was living there again. Word spread quickly. The sheriff sent a deputy to confirm who had taken residence. He returned white as chalk, claiming he'd heard 2 women crying beneath the floor. The sounds had been rhythmic, almost like chanting, followed by the dragging of chains. When the deputy demanded to see who lived there, the door opened just an inch, and 2 enormous eyes stared back from the dark. Days later, a traveling doctor arrived in Stillwater. He claimed to be tracing genealogies of post-war families and asked if anyone remembered the Boones. Against warnings, he rode to the farmhouse alone. That night, thunder rolled over the valley, though no rain fell. By dawn, his horse returned riderless, its flanks streaked with blood. When a search party finally gathered the courage to approach the house, what they found didn't fit any sense of reason. The door was bolted from outside, yet faint voices could be heard within. The smell of rot mixed with something sweeter, like perfume. They broke the lock and entered. Inside, the house was suffocatingly warm. Blankets were nailed over the windows, every mirror turned to face the wall. On the mantel sat 2 children's cribs carved from oak, each filled with small bones wrapped in cloth. A rocking chair swayed gently on its own, the floor beneath it dark with old stains. The cellar door was worse. A new layer of iron had been fixed over it, bolts tightened by inhuman strength. Behind it they could hear movement, wet, deliberate, slow. Something dragged itself closer to the barrier, and a woman's voice whispered, "Please, don't let them out." The men fled. By nightfall, the sheriff ordered the farmhouse boarded up. In his official report he wrote simply, "Property abandoned. Possible infestation or deranged occupants, but not everyone left quietly." The blacksmith's wife, curious and unafraid, returned days later to fetch her husband's tools from the site. She never came home. When her body was found weeks later, her spine had been broken clean in two, as though something had bent her backwards until she split. By the end of that year, the entire valley emptied. Only one man, the deputy who'd first heard the cries, stayed behind. He claimed he could still see the Boone brothers at dusk, standing behind the upstairs window, unmoving, waiting for someone to knock. And though the house was sealed, townsfolk began hearing something new on windless nights. The sound of two men laughing beneath the earth, and the faint echo of a woman's lullaby carried through the trees. For 17 years, the Boone farmhouse stood untouched. Ivy swallowed the walls, roots split the porch, and rain bled through the roof like rusted veins. By 1894, Stillwater Hollow had become a ghost valley, a place hunters avoided and travelers passed by in silence. But one autumn morning, a team of surveyors arrived to mark new rail lines. Their foreman, a man named Jacob Kerr, didn't believe in curses. He believed in progress. On their second day, Kerr's crew cleared the ground around the Boone ruins. Beneath a layer of collapsed boards, they uncovered a cellar door still sealed with iron bands. The bolts were fused as if melted from within. One of the men joked that the door looked more like a tomb than a basement. Another noticed something worse. Faint scratches on the underside of the boards, long and uneven, like fingernails dragging upward. Kerr insisted on breaking through. When they pried the iron loose, a breath of air escaped, heavy, sour and warm, as if from a living thing. The men lit a lantern and descended the stairs. The cellar was dry, untouched by weather, and in its center, shackled to the stone floor, was a human skeleton, still chained at the neck and ankles. The bones were massive, unmistakably male. The skull had caved inward, the jaw broken, but the iron collar remained tight against what was left of the throat. Near it lay a rusted Bible, the pages fused together by time and blood. On the last readable page, one line had been underlined twice in dried ink: "He that spareth the rod hateth his son." But that wasn't the only body. In the far corner, they found a second skeleton, smaller, curled in a fetal position, its fingers locked around a child's rattle carved from wood. Unlike the first, this body had been laid carefully, almost reverently, covered by a tattered quilt. Someone had come back and buried her. The county coroner, when called, dated the remains decades apart. The man had died sometime in the winter of 1877, the woman likely years later. Locals believed it was Temperance Boone, the last surviving sister, returning to the house to die beside her family, or perhaps to ensure the chains were never opened again. After the discovery, the farmhouse was burned to the ground under court order, but the ashes refused to scatter. When the wind blew through Stillwater Hollow, people said the soot rose in the shape of hands, reaching upward, grasping for air. The rail line was diverted. The valley remains empty to this day, and if you stand on that ground at midnight, some swear you can still hear two voices under the soil, one praying for forgiveness, and the other whispering lullabies to bones that never found rest.